Hi, my name is Lian and we're going to be interviewing you today.
Yeah, so I'm Rama Durdasawi. I'm also the same school as Lian, and yeah.
Yeah, again, pleasure to meet both of you. I'm very happy to have this chat.
Upon reading your work and looking at all of your research, we found a couple of questions that we'd like to ask you. So, first of all, we wanted to ask what evoked your interest in studying the field of consciousness? Is there any personal story behind why you chose to study this?
I think it's hard to know for me. It seems to be an interest that's always been there, in one way or another. I certainly remember when I was pretty young, I don't know, like 8 or 9 or something like that, just realizing that at some point, I would probably die and not exist, and at some other point I wasn't there. So where was I before I was born? I think every kid, at some point, we have this recognition that we live for a time, and then that just leads to all these other questions about, okay, why am I me and not somebody else? And with my friends at school, I think then later on in the next few years, it's quite common. I'd be interested to know, for you, whether with your friends you talk about these things, like, do we have free will, and like, these sort of big questions, but then, because the education system wasn't really, there was no course in this, so I just started doing other things, but the interest was always there, I think, in the back of my mind. And in hindsight, it looks like this was a very clear plan to end up researching consciousness, but it wasn't. It only makes sense looking backwards. At the time, I didn't really know what the next thing I was going to do was. But looking back, I was always trying to find some way into this.
So I think you briefly mentioned something about the education system and how they don't really focus on the idea of consciousness or anything from our awareness around us. So one of the questions that I wanted to ask is, since we're IB students, I was wondering if your research on embodied cognition and consciousness in general, could it link to education in schools today, and would it change the way that teachers educate children?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And I mean, yeah, I'm impressed to raise the topic of embodied cognition. I mean, this is really sort of pretty advanced cognitive science when people start talking about this. My colleague at Sussex and good friend Andy Clark has written a lot of wonderful things about, the idea that our mind is not just what the brain does, it's what the brain and the body do, and what the brain and the body and the environment do. And yeah, I do think this, I should have to say that I don't have a good answer to your question. And I think one of the important things in being an academic is to admit when you don't know something. And this is not my field of expertise, like education policy, but clearly there ought to be implications for education, because embodied cognition is shifting away from like the brain as a little computer in the head, just sort of storing memories and facts and then doing reasoning based on them. And I think probably a lot of education is based on that kind of fairly old style idea. But to the extent that you can help people think through things and be more active participants, I suppose it would be one of the general lessons. I imagine this is happening anyways, probably since I was at school, where you just sort of sat there and like read stuff in textbooks and that was it. Hopefully it's a bit more interactive now. Is it?
Debatable, somewhat.
Somewhat. Okay, probably not then. I mean, that would certainly help. Just this moving away from education as learning a bunch of facts to learning skills, and not just physical skills, but mental skills. Learning how to think, not what to know, I think would be absolutely critical. But exactly how you build that in, I don't really know. I mean, what I have noticed is, so I was involved in this project last year called the Dream Machine, which is a big kind of public art science project. And as part of that, we developed a bunch of schools resources, probably for people a bit younger than you, so like sort of 7 to 13, something like that. But it wasn't really about the how. This was more about the what, because the curricula in the UK anyway still didn't really cover things like consciousness and philosophy and free will and perception. But I think these things are just super important for people to know about. Like I honestly think that it should be core. Maybe it is in the IB. I wanted to ask you about this later. Maybe it is in the IB core part of the curriculum to learn about who we are, learn a little bit about how the mind works, because unless we know this, navigating the world depends on understanding how we engage with it, understanding how we perceive and the biases that we might have in thinking and making decisions. Otherwise, to develop some sort of critical skills in this area. Otherwise, we'll just believe everything we read in the papers and see on the news, and that's not going so well, is it?
Yeah, and just in response to your question about whether or not IB does incorporate this, we have a section that every IB student has to complete, which is known as Theory of Knowledge, which we call TOK. And TOK is almost like philosophy. It doesn't really focus so much on the mind, but it focuses more on kind of like perceptions of thinking in a way, and like, why do we know? How do we know? So it's kind of, intertwining this mentality in a more direct way than other curriculums, which is, a nice thing about this. So, it is a bit more developed than before, but yeah.
That's good. Yeah, I mean, I was always impressed. I had a few friends who did the IB in England that I met when I went to university, and I was just like, I was quite jealous of the broad base of what they got to study, because we had to focus on 3 subjects for A levels, and for me 2 of those were maths, so that wasn't very diverse at all.
Yeah. Okay, and now moving on to the next question. The infamous, so as we already mentioned, we're IB students, and me and Rama both take psychology for IB, and we take it at a higher level, so we study it in more depth, so we're a bit more familiar with the theories that you're speaking of than a few others would be. So one of the studies that we cover is Bartlett, and he conducted a study in the 1930s. I'm assuming you're familiar with it. And it's to do with schema theory and this idea that the way that we perceive things is not actually what we experience, but rather an interpretation and an active reconstruction of what we see. So your research highlights the individuality of perception and how specific it is to each person. So do you think that your research would link to support his theory? And if so, how?
So you're going to have to tell me a bit more about Bartlett's theories, because, I mean, I've heard of them, but to be honest, I'm sure you know more about them than I do at this point, because I haven't really focused much on that for a while. So what kind of level of description how is his theory described? Like, is it sort of general, schemas exist in the mind, or is it like, it's not a neuroscience theory, is it? It's probably more general. So tell me.
No, it's a general theory. Yeah. It's basically this idea that every person doesn't really, like, when we recall our memories, we don't think of our memories as what they actually were. We don't see them as what we actually experienced, but instead we see them as interpretations and perceptions based off previous knowledge that we already have. So it's this idea that we have previous knowledge known as a schema, which would influence the way that we interpret different information. So yeah, that's just like a general summary of what he says.
Yeah, I think so. It sounds, I mean, it is, there's a long tradition, I think, as you probably know, of this kind of thinking about perception and about knowledge and memory. In philosophy, this goes back at least as far as Immanuel Kant, who's well known for saying that we can never experience reality as it actually is. It's always an interpretation. The objective reality is hidden behind the senses, and we can only ever experience an interpretation of it. I think the schema theories in psychology focus a little bit less on the perception. It's more about the frames of knowledge that we bring to something, and then more recently, this whole line of thinking about the brain as a prediction machine and about predictive processing is very much in line with that. And the thing there I think that's interesting is it dissolves this boundary between perception on the one hand and cognition and belief. Because previously, like in a lot of sort of 20th century psychology, people often thought of these two processes as quite distinct. So, we perceive the world and then we make decisions about it or think about it and form memories and so on. But there's no reason there should be a hard and fast distinction between perception and cognition and predictive processing, among others. There is no sharp distinction. And all stages are influenced by prior beliefs, prior expectations. And these can be prior beliefs that you have, like, you might have memories of particular things and then interpret new information in light of the memories and beliefs that that you have. But the interesting thing, of course, is a lot of the time you don't know that you have these beliefs or that your brain has these beliefs. And these beliefs can be very kind of low level, like the belief that light comes from above, which is not a belief that most people know their brain has, but brains interpret visual information using that belief, to beliefs that about your social, political environment that, again, you might not know that you have. That they've been installed in your minds through education, through development, through the culture you live in. I think the key interesting distinction here for me is that a lot of people would describe these things, these like schemas, as sort of influencing what we might perceive or believe. But it could be, and I don't know if this is what Bartlett says, and you can tell me, could be that it's not just they influence what you perceive and believe, but they are what you perceive and believe. I think this is the interesting flip that I like exploring in my work, which is, it's not that the brain's predictions kind of just shape what we see. They are what we see. So perception comes from the inside out, not the outside in. And that's quite counterintuitive because it doesn't seem like that, right? It seems like we just see the world and it sort of comes into our minds, but it's the other way around. And that's always, for me, this is one of the most just thought-provoking concepts in neuroscience and psychology. So I think it's compatible, but yeah, you'll have to tell me a bit more about what you think, knowing more about Bartlett than I do.
Yeah, I just completely agree with what you said. Like, what you're saying is essentially just reinforcing his theory. And, we take it pretty vaguely. We don't go into as much detail. But yeah, it's pretty much reinforcing each other. So I just thought that it would be a cool link to make.
Yeah, it is. It's a very cool link. It's not one I'd made before. So yeah, it's great. There's another, just one other point on that. There's another researcher called Michael Graziano in the US. And he has a whole idea called attention schema theory. And he's a book called The Social Brain, which is a very nice book. I think it's called The Social Brain. And so he might make I'm just guessing because they both use the word schema, that he might make more explicit link to Bartlett. Consciousness and the Social Brain. Yeah, this is it. It's a very nice book.
So basically, upon reading about some details of your book, the New Science of Consciousness, and more research that you've done, obviously one of the main things that you talk about is consciousness. So my question is, how do you believe that the idea of consciousness, from research that you've done and from everything that you've gathered, links to us in the world making predictions and assumptions to what's really around us?
A lot of it depends on definitions and things like that, which is always a bit annoying, but it can't be avoided. Consciousness for me is the most general phenomenon, and it marks the difference between being the difference between being awake and aware and like being in a coma or being a table or being dead, these things where consciousness is completely gone. So consciousness is kind of a state that makes other particular kinds of experience possible. And so there's a big question. I mean, perhaps the biggest question is, how is consciousness possible at all? What is it about this stuff inside our heads that makes us more than just biological robots that just do stuff? Why is there any experience? And to me, this is still a mystery. And I think anybody, I've learned, in my field, I talk to some, I'm lucky enough to meet a lot of really smart, accomplished philosophers and scientists. Some of them quite confident they know what's going on, others seem less so, but I think actually, no, if you really ask people, nobody knows. It's still a mystery. And it's quite reassuring in a way. Like we're still all, in some sense, it's as mysterious now as it was when I was starting, like as it has been for thousands of years. But it's an everyday kind of mystery and miracle because we are conscious, and that's what makes life worth living. But a lot of times when I think about it, actually, of course, I think we do know a lot more than was the case 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 10 years ago. And I think actually the way I think about it has changed quite a lot too. So it still seems mysterious, but in a more interesting way than it did before, not as just this like big scary mystery, but there's so many fascinating aspects to it, some of which we understand, some of which we don't. And one of the things we understand more is, I think, how, given that we are conscious, what determines what we are conscious of, and so what determines the nature of our experience of the world and of being a self. And that's, for me, where this idea of the brain as a prediction machine really comes in, because all of these things, to me, can be understood as forms of prediction the brain is making about the world and the body. But it's still really at the start of the story. I'm just at this meeting in Holland now, and it's really interesting because there's a whole different branch of philosophy being discussed here, which is called phenomenology, which is the sort of, instead of asking these like questions about how brains might generate experience, it's asking questions about, well, what is experience really like? We make a lot of assumptions about what our lived daily day-to-day experience is actually like, and maybe we're not actually very good at knowing our own experiences. So there's this whole branch of philosophy which is trying to explain more about that. And in philosophy, that's a very different kind of tradition of thinking, and bringing that together with things like embodied cognition and all is really challenging. So this is one of the exciting things for me, is it's still learning, and you never know which direction things are going to go.
Yeah, I definitely think that keeping stuff sometimes a mystery and not knowing every single thing would be better, even for like the new generation that are coming up, so that they can go into researching about it. But yeah, sure. Thank you.
Next, I just wanted to ask, obviously the theory of consciousness and perception can be seen as very invasive. So I personally, when I was reading your research, I was thinking about how difficult it would be to study it without, having too many ethical considerations. So have you ever experienced any ethical concerns while conducting your research because of how invasive the nature of studying it is? And if so, how are you able to overcome this?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And it's something I think every scientist sort of struggles with a bit. Of course, we have ethics committees and so on that in every experiment we do, we have to just write about the ethical considerations and how we're going to deal with them and so on. And they'll differ for different kinds of studies. I mean, but it's not been too much of an obstacle. I mean, firstly, people are curious about this kind of thing. Often people want to engage. They want to participate and if possible learn a bit more about their own minds and brains. So there's an eagerness. But some of the like back before I was doing anything, like in the sort of 60s, 70s, people were doing experiments for which you'd never be able to do now, which sort of involved deceiving people and making them pretend they're in prison and playing roles of being a prisoner or a prison guard. That's famous Stanford prison experiments. I mean, you'll never, for good reason, will never do those experiments again, because they can really mess around with people's minds. But most of the time, that's not the case. In my personal experience, most of the experiments we do are actually just fairly boring for the people who do them. It's like you sit in front of a computer and you just press yes and no, and like, are the dots moving one way or another way? And there's not a huge number of ethical concerns there. Of course, other areas of neuroscience, it becomes trickier, right? If you're going to intervene in people's brains, let's say, that's another ball game, whether it's through drugs, whether it's through sticking electrodes in and so on. Of course, these things can only be done for very, very good reason, and often done in association with, for instance, if somebody needs brain surgery anyway, then you can do it. So in collaboration with hospitals and brain surgeons. And then psychiatry is a whole other area where there's a lot of significant ethical concerns, working with people who are suffering from psychosis or depression or severe mental conditions of other sorts. You've just got to be very careful that you're not going to make things worse. This big project, I don't know if you've seen, so part of the Dream Machine thing is this big perception census project. It relates to a little bit earlier in our conversation, talking about we each see the world differently, because we have different brains, so we make different predictions. So we're trying to measure this with this perception census to get as many people as possible to take part, and it's an online set of experiments. It's unfortunate. This is one of the ethics thing. We were restricted because of ethics to only allow people over the age of 18 to take part. And it's fairly arbitrary, right? I mean, there's no reason to think there's any concern in you guys taking part, apart from like the general thing that until you're 18, you have to get parental consent for everything, basically. And that was too much. We just couldn't do that. It's impractical for what we're doing. So it does affect, sometimes it affects us. And I think this is a negative thing, because by construction, this experiment, which we've got more than 20,000 people already, but we don't know anything about what people under the age of 18 would respond. And I'd like to know that. But we can't find it out. So there's a pro and a con to these ethics things. They restrict flexibility, but of course, if without them, the dangers, the risks would be much higher, because people can, they can just get very fixated on doing the experiments they want to do, and we need sensible ethical guidelines. And even with the perception census, because it's going to the general public who don't really know anything about psychology or philosophy, they had worries that I didn't expect them to have, like, are you trying to control us through these things? Are you selling our data to Google? It's like, no, we're not, and no, we're not. It's like none of these things are happening. But we have to be very, very clear about this, because people, I think, rightly get a bit suspicious. It's a bit ironic, because they have these concerns, yet they probably go on Instagram or Facebook or whatever and give all their personal data away absolutely freely without worrying about it.
Question, but we've been coming at you with like a lot of questions. So final question is just, do you have any questions that you want to ask me and Lian about anything?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in how you got interested in these kinds of areas, and what this sort of future looks like for you. What do you see yourself doing, and how how is the education system helping, and are you learning the things you think you need to learn, and that's my main question. How did you get interested in this area, things we've been talking about, and what does the future look like for you?
Okay, I think I'll go first and then Lian will. So for me, basically, in year 10, so that was about 2 years ago, I did the ICSE certificate where I took psychology. And one of the first few things that we learned in psychology is neuropsychology, which I thought linked greatly to like neuroscience in general. Also in psychology, we learned about Sigmund Freud. So his idea of the conscious, the subconscious, the brain in general, our perception. So I think it's a really interesting field. And as you mentioned before, it's something that consciousness and perception in general is something that you wonder or you question from when you're a kid. You go like, oh yeah, but how is it like that? And where am I? And stuff like that. So it's a really interesting field to get into more detail in when you're older and you can. And yeah, for me, basically when I'm older, I'm hoping to go into something to do with medicine, possibly medicine with the brain, so neurology or even psychiatry. Or I would, if medicine doesn't work, I would probably go into neuroscience. So that's how I would want my future to look like.
Excellent. Well, very good luck. I mean, that sounds like a fantastic plan. Of course, plans change, but that's good to have plans, but to retain a bit of flexibility, that's fantastic. Yes, Lian, what about you?
For me, I also took the IBCSE course for psychology and also biology as well. And for IB, I chose psychology and biology as two of my higher level subjects. So I take them in a lot of depth, and I know Rama does too. She's with me in my classes. So I know for a fact, like since year 10, as Rama mentioned, we started briefly touching up upon, especially in psychology and biology, it's almost like not a topic of great discussion to talk about things related to neuroscience, other than the simple neurology and what is a neuron and neurotransmission, but not so much about the cognitions and the things to do with perception and all of these different fields where there's a big question mark related to it. So I think what really interested me in psychology was that biological aspect of it. So it was almost like the in-between of my two favorite subjects. So I was really interested in learning about that. And when I found out about your work as well to do with neuroscience, it really interested me. And as for my future, I'm hoping to eventually study medicine, but I'd like to study in the US. So I need a pre-medical degree first. So I was thinking of maybe doing that in neuroscience or possibly biochemistry. So something to do with that first. And we'll end up seeing.
Yeah, we'll end up seeing, but this is great. I mean, I didn't study medicine myself, and actually sometimes I think, that's one of the regrets, because there's always like, there's now, I'm one removed from actually interacting directly with patients and helping them. It has to be done through which is fine. It can be done. And so I do a lot of work that has medical implications, but I can't do it myself. But you can't do everything, so that's fine. But I'm very excited to hear about your plans, and it gives me great hope for the future, which is what this festival is about. So that's fantastic.